Hey everybody, welcome back and welcome to chapter 5. So, in the previous chapter, we finished off our second hero pass, so we covered a lot of those really intricate details that we can see here in front of us. Now, we're going to be going over our UVs. So, we'll be UVing this first before we mirror it. We'll also be grouping it and we'll be naming it before we mirror it too. The reason for that is because if we have everything prepped on one side of the vehicle, it means that when we come to flip it over, we have everything also prepped on that side. There's going to be a few small changes, so we've got our asymmetrical parts that we'll have to bear in mind. We'll have to weld some pieces together as well, and we'll have to account for various changes on the inside, on the interior, so for the passenger side basically. Other than that though, we want to make sure that everything's prepped, UV'd accordingly, then we can flip it, make those adjustments, and then we can finally group everything together. So we'll go through UVing first, and then we can move on to hierarchy and groups and everything else. So first things first, we're going to be cleaning up our scene and deleting all that geometry that we had backed up from the modeling process. We'll start with the wheels. We've got those grouped from last time, so we'll select those, we'll group them together, and we'll take them out and put them at the bottom of our outliner. We'll call those wheels for now, we can hide them, and then we'll select all of our geometry, and we can delete history by going Shift, Alt and D to delete history on everything. Otherwise, you can go up to the Edit tab at the top, go to Delete by Type, and delete history there as well. So we're just removing any history that we don't need on that geometry. We've grouped it, and we can hide it. So I've already versioned up our saves, we're on version 10, so everything's backed up in our old save anyway. So we can go ahead now and we can select everything in our outliner except those groups and except our reference cameras, and we can just go ahead and hit delete. We don't need any of this stuff anymore. And then after that, we'll go to scene optimization. So this is going to flush out everything that we don't need, like any shaders that were unused, any extra history lying around. So to do that, just go to File at the top and then go to Optimize Scene Size. And then we're going to select OK. A few background operations will run, and then before you know it, everything's been flushed out. So once that's done, we can select all of our geometry, and we can go to the Modify tab at the top, and we can go to Center Pivot, so that will center the pivot on every single piece of geometry. We can then select all of our geometry again, we can go back to the Modify tab, and then we can go to Freeze Transforms. So this will center the pivot and freeze the transforms on all of our geometry. So generally speaking, we always want to center the pivot on our geometry anyway, but we always want to make sure that we freeze our transforms whenever we can as well. Obviously there are certain exceptions where we want to keep those transforms there, but we want to keep things frozen when we're about to UV them, because there's essentially another layer of history from moving vertices around, grabbing edge loops and pulling them around, and that can actually cause effects to the UVs. So if we didn't freeze things now and we decided to freeze them after UVing, we can often find that edges have been stretched or things have crumpled, and we don't want to have that basically. So it's best to just freeze everything before we UV, and then we're going to save ourselves that headache later on. And if you were wondering about groups as well, we can actually go to the Select tab, and we can go to Select Hierarchy, and then we can also do that. So we can go to Center Pivot again, we can freeze transforms again. So now we've also done the same thing, but on all of our group nulls as well. Okay, so let's do some UVing. So first things first, we'll go to our UV tab at the top, and we'll open our UV editor. And then I'm just going to drag and drop this until the blue bar appears, and I'll be merging that to my viewport. And then I'll hit the modeling tab just to minimize that. And I'll be working on one monitor for this, but obviously normally I'll use two different screens for my UV layout. So I'm just going to have a half and half going on here between the viewport and our UV layout. So just before we dip into UVing in Maya, I thought it was worth mentioning why we're going to be doing it with the native toolset. So in the industry, we generally use a few tools, right? We'll use Nightshade, which plugs into Maya. We've also got a third-party tool called UV Layout, which is its own separate piece of software. I'm personally just choosing to use Maya's native toolset for this tutorial, but I generally use it with my personal work anyway. I think the toolset has evolved quite a lot over the last few years, and there are some fairly useful tools that make UVing faster. And generally speaking, with the other modelers I've worked with at various other studios, I've seen most of them just stick with Maya's toolkit these days for UVing. But don't get me wrong, if you want to use UV Layout or Nightshade or anything else, there are some great tools out there for sure. But for this tutorial, we're just going to stick to the native toolset, and I'll just show you the tips and tricks that I find really speeds up the UVing process. So we can sort of tackle this in any order really. We can start from the biggest pieces going down to the smallest. I like to sort of generally work my way around in section by section because I'm grouping it as I go along as well. So we can start with the truck bed, with this panel on the side, and all I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to automatic UVs, so we get them all laid out nice and flat, and then we can just weld them back together wherever it makes sense. There are a few visual tools that I use as well, so it's just the standard heat map, which is this white texture on our UVs. So if anything goes red or blue, it means that we're squashing or we're stretching things too much, and we don't want that for our textures to look nice. I'll also switch between that and what you saw before, which is the normal direction. So blue is facing the correct way, red is facing the wrong way. So we can either flip those back if we need to, or keep them the wrong way, so that we can reuse texture tiles on any repeatable pieces. I've also got my UV borders tool switched on, so that's the window icon in the top left of our UV editor viewport. And this also basically allows me to see if there's any splits that I've missed. It's actually highlighted with a slightly thicker edge, so you can see that visually a lot easier. So when we're happy with this, we can just rotate it and get it into the correct orientation. So I also like to make sure that all of my UVs are the correct rotation. So we can always get away with this the easy way by just UV packing everything with Maya's UV layout tools. But the truth is, that's not going to do the best job, right? For the smaller pieces, it's fine. We can use the layout tools for that. But for the bigger pieces and the important pieces especially, I like to manually pack my UVs. The reason for that is because when we go to texture this, or if we hand this off to another texture artist, we want to make sure that they have everything they need to be a lot more efficient with the way they do their work as well. So that means we have all the UVs the correct way round, all of our tubes and everything else are straight and they're nice and flat. We're avoiding any snaking or bending in our UVs overall, and we'll also want to provide them with the right texel density as well. So texel density is just the unit of measurement across our UVs, so it sort of has to correspond along one unit size so that everything is the exact right size. So we don't want to see this panel on the side of our truck have a nice crispy sharp texture, but then the panel next to it be super low res and pixelated. So by having a consistent texel density across our UVs, we can avoid that. So it's usually at the start of a project where we can sort of figure out what our texel density is going to be. So if we check out our UV toolkit on the right hand side of our screen, where it says get and set, that value in the middle is our texel density. So for now we've got a texel size of about 3.4, but that might need to change. So let's just keep that for now and then see how we get on with the next few pieces. So before we do that, I just want to add a few more edge loops to this piece. So as I mentioned in the previous chapters, we wanted to use the least amount of edge loops possible to achieve our details first. So now that we're happy with our model and we're about to UV it, we are at a stage now where we can add some of these extra edge loops back in. So the reason we're going to do this is because we want to prevent any stretching on the textures. We might have that on the edges, so we'll need some more fencing, but we can also use this time to add edge loops to any faces that are too stretched or long. So as I go through UVing this, you might see me adding extra edge loops here and there, just so we can prevent any of that stretching later on in the texturing phase. So just jumping a bit ahead here, we've gotten to this piece which is like a curved trim around our wheel. So the usual way we could do this is we could do a camera projection and then we can slice up the corners and flatten it out. But the chances are that if we do that, we're going to end up with like a bit of a curved snaky mesh because Maya isn't quite sure how to lay out a curved piece of geometry like this. We can also try automatic UVs like this. This isn't the most optimal way either. So here's where we can use a really good technique called unitizing and then moving and sewing them together again. So the way we do this is if we go to our UV toolset and we go to our modify and then we go to unitize, we're going to be breaking down this model into its individual faces and then we're going to be rebuilding them from there. And then what we can do is we can go into the model and we can unselect one of our edges, so that's where we're going to cut it, and then we'll unselect the other sides of the edges, and then we do the same thing on the other side. We can hold down shift, we can right click, and we can move our cursor up to move and sew those edges back together. And then it will look like this afterwards, so we have a sort of gridded like look, and then we can grab all of our UV points and then we can hold shift again and we can swing our cursor to the left and land on the unfold button. So it will be completely straightened out and we have a much better result doing it this way than if we would do an unfold and then slicing things up and trying to relax them. And then afterwards we can scroll down our UV toolkit and we can orient the shelves, We can straighten UVs as well, and that's going to make sure everything is perfectly straight now. So it means that when we come to texture this piece, we won't actually have to do it across a curved piece of geometry. We can just use a continuous piece of metal or wear and tear or whatever down a straight line, and we know that it's going to flow nicely along that curve. And you can use this for many different things. Tubes, pipes, wires, anything that's long or cylindrical, you can use it on that, and it's always a really good result, and it's going to make things much easier for the texture artist as well. I can show another example here as well with the roof rack piping. We just unitize. We can select all of our edges, and then we can deselect one of those loops to be our seam. We'll shift and move up to sew them all together, and then we can swing to the left to unfold or swing to the right to optimize. And then we can hit the orient shells button, we can hit this straighten UVs button just to make sure it's all completely straight, and then when we're happy with the orientation, we can set our texel density in the corner. So it doesn't work perfectly every single time, and it won't always work on every object, but as long as you can get it in a good position that you can start and relax the UV points a little bit, and then straighten again and do a few passes that way, you can get a lot of shapes to be very straight and clean. And again, for texturing, it's really useful to have the UVs this way. So I've just applied the same thing to the rest of those pipes. I've packed them together, they're oriented the way I want them, and we can call that done. So I thought I would just show you one more example of the unitized trick on a more curved piece of geometry. So we've got our cylinder here from our winch, and typically we would unfold this by camera projection, slicing through one of the middle pieces, and then unfolding it. But that would leave us with a curved, snaky piece of geometry, and we just don't really want that for our textures. So what we can do is we can break off the caps either side and leave those, and we can do the unitized trick again, and then we are left with a bit of a curved piece still. But here's where we can use the straighten UVs. We can grab either ends and just make sure that they level out as well, and then we've got our piece again. So small things like this really help out texturing, and I guarantee you that if you're passing this over to a texture artist, they're really going to appreciate you making this extra effort, because I know that a lot of the people I work with in VFX, every time that they get this sort of thing, it makes their life so much easier, and they will often let you know that as well, by the way, so it's always worth doing if it helps people out. So I'm just jumping ahead here to our cabin, so everything's been UV'd and laid out nicely. I've got everything the right orientation that works for me, and my texel density is set across these shells, so they're all the right size, and also I'm actually grouping everything in their respective groups after I'm done. So the cabin can have its own group, the trailer bed can have its own group, the wheels are their own group, so we're kind of building up our hierarchy as we go along as well. Now something else that's quite useful that I can show you is having multiple UV sets in the form of map 1 and map 2. So for context, sometimes when we're doing an asset with something like a rope or cable or anything else, we often pack our UVs into a single UV tile, but we also like to have a map 2 that allows us to have a full size piece of geometry that we can use to have a sort of tileable piece of rope texture or wire texture. So if I just jump into this, I can show you what I'm talking about. So if we go back to our UV tab and we go down to the second option, which is our UV set editor. So map 1 is the same UV set that we have for everything, right? But we can copy this into a map 2, and this can basically be where our larger piece of cable can sit. So we can rename this as map 2. And if we just toggle between these two, you'll see that our UV shells are the exact same. So we're going to keep map 1 as our original UVs, but then for map 2, we'll have our larger cable piece. So I'll just shuffle the rest to the side, just so it's visually easier to show you, but we can just scale that up, and we can snap that to the corner, and then we can make sure those edges touch either side of the shell, and that's it, that's all we have to do. So the texture artist can take this map 2, and they can essentially apply a sort of infinite rope texture or wire texture along that axis, and it really helps with adding some high definition texturing to ropes and things. It's not often used that much, but now and then it's really useful to have, and some texture artists actually prefer to work this way. So just speak to your texture artist and ask them what they'd like, or if you're doing it yourself, just decide whether you want to do that or not, whether you need to. It's more for the close-ups when we want to see this sort of thing, so that's when a map 2 can be more useful. So if we apply all of these UV tips and tricks to our model, we eventually end up with something like this. So we have our truck left side, and we've got all of our UDIMs here. Everything is the correct texel density, so it's around 2.5 to 3-ish around all of the pieces. I've actually grouped them by material as well. So you'll see there's a lot of empty patches here, and the reason for that is because we have all of our metals here, we have all of our rubbers here, we have our plastics, we have our wood, we have our leather. All of that is separated by material. And the reason we've done that is because a lot of texture artists at main studios like to texture based on materials instead. So it means that if we're using something like Substance or even Mari, we can just drag and drop shaders and we can set our masks to entire UDIMs. We don't have to spend lots of time running around different shells and masking whatever we can see that might be metal or wood. It's clearly laid out exactly what material is what material. And this really speeds up the process as well. So if you're doing this for yourself or if you're doing this for another texture artist, again, they're going to really appreciate this extra effort. And also on top of that, I've oriented everything correctly. So everything that's horizontal or vertical on the model is the same orientation in the UVs. And the reason for that is because if we do any wear and tear or weathering, we want to make sure it's running correctly down the right axis. So I've also accounted for that. And then I've also gathered all of my nuts and bolts and things. They have their own UV tiles because it's easier to find them all in one location and manage them from there. So we have separate shells here for those. And then we have all of our railings nice and straight using that unitized tip I showed you earlier. So this is kind of what you'll end up with when we have everything put into practice. And what you'll also notice is that I have a truck center section as well. So these are essentially all of the pieces that will not be mirrored. They're the unique pieces. So I like to leave those separate as well, because we're going to have a truck left, a truck center, and a truck right. And we'd often publish the model with these groups as well. So what we'll have is the center hidden. We'll take our left, we'll flip it over, and then we can shift all of our UV tiles up so they've got matching UVs on either side, and then our center UVs can sit next to those as well. So it's all going to be very clean and nicely organized. So we can park our UVs for now and we can focus on the naming. So like I said before, I have most of these things grouped. I'll have front left, I'll have back left, I'll have just left, and then I'm going to go into each of these groups and rename each of these pieces accordingly. So generally speaking, in various studios, we have our own ways of doing things. Some studios like to be very particular about naming each part. Other studios are happy with you naming it whatever you'd like to name it. You can have your naming as in-depth and precise, or as simple as you'd like to have it. But for this tutorial, I'm just going to go with what naming I generally use, because when we take it into texturing, it's not really going to matter. As long as we've got a rough idea of what part is what, then that's fine. But if we're working on a show, we have to think about what naming makes sense for others downstream. So the rigging team, for example, a lot of their rigging tools might work with naming conventions, and that's what they'll use to build their rigs. So sometimes having left and right can help the rigging team too, because they can do a similar operation of flipping their rig over to the other side. Or the FX team might want to have certain naming conventions. It's always good to check with all of those teams as well. But to keep things simple, we'll go with a left grouping and a right grouping and a center grouping. And we'll just keep the naming quite simple as well. So as an example, if we go to our tow hook at the front here, if we just open that up, we can see here that we haven't got anything named just yet. But what we can do is if we select all of our pieces in the order that we want, and then we can go up to the rename tool. So we can use the naming convention with capital L for left, and then hook, and then we can do an underscore, and then we can just hit enter. And what it will do is it will read that underscore and add a value on the end of it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for example. And that's a really quick way of building up our naming conventions throughout the asset. So I've just jumped ahead again here. So I've just named everything accordingly. So super simple naming, and we've got a number on the end for each part. And we're just going to go through this list here just to show you all of them. We also have the same for the center as well. So we have all of our center parts here. And all we'll do now is we'll get them mirrored over to the other side, and then we can rename them when we flip them. So at this point, we're good to go. We've got our UVs sorted. We've got our naming sorted. So now is the moment we can finally flip everything over to the other side. So all I have to do now is duplicate that group, and then we can hit R to get our scale tool. We can hold J on the keyboard, and assuming that your step snap value in your modeling toolkit is set to 1 by default, we're going to be flipping over perfectly to -1. So I'm just going to add a value of -4 as well, because we're still actually intersecting along the middle of our vehicle, and we know that those edges should match perfectly along the center of world space. So around -3 or 4 is what I've gone with, just to make it perfectly symmetrical along the middle. And when I'm happy with that, we can go to our mesh display tab and we can go down to reverse. So we're going to be flipping our normals to be the correct side up. And then we'll just give it a moment to load it because there's quite a lot of geometry to process. And then we're done. So now, just to be safe, we'll select all of that flipped geometry again. And we can go back to our mesh display and then we can go to unlock normals, just to make sure that none of them are locked so we don't have weird lighting or texture issues later on. So now that we have that out of the way, we can just test it against our reference cameras now. So we can A/B on both sides now and see how close we've gotten it. So considering we haven't had to do any changes yet, we've actually gotten it really close. So obviously there's adjustments that we have to make, like the mud flaps for example, but the wing mirrors look good, those rails on the side look good, the roof rack's pretty good. We can alter the light a little bit, but we always knew there'd be some offsets because this vehicle isn't perfect. It's obviously had a lot of work done to it, it's very old, and even on the back view, we can see that we're pretty close considering that there's a weird camera issue as well. Even on our side view, we're bang on. So we've actually done a really good job of lining this up. So we've got a decent result here with very few changes to make. So now we can just quickly run through all of these center pieces and weld everything together in the middle. So we're just going to use the scale tool, bring everything into the center, and then quickly just go to edit mesh and weld those pieces with a merge tool. So we're just going to do 0.01 just to make sure that we're actually welding individual verts together, not doing multiple, so we're not going to have any pinching. So all of these new pieces will go into our center group since they're now central pieces. So after I combined and welded all of those pieces in the center, I've added them back to that central group and renamed them to C parts. And now we can take our left side duplicated group and we can rename that. So all we have to do is select the hierarchy again, and then we can go to modify, we can go to search and replace names, and then we can just type in L because that's the letter we want to replace, and we want to replace that with the letter R. So capital L, capital R, we'll make sure that it's hierarchy selected, we can apply, and just like that it's swapped everything out from left to right. So all of those pieces that we named before have now gone from left parts to right parts. That's how easy it is. So sometimes you can have a few parts that are finicky, you might have to go in and hand clean those up, but generally speaking it always works like a charm, so I tend to use this tool a lot. And there we have it. So we have our left side, we have our right side, we've got our center, we can group that now, and this will be our final group for our truck. And I just thought I'd show you the updated layout for the UVs too after mirroring those over. So all I've done is they're the same UVs as before. I've just bumped them all up to reflect our left side being in there now. So you'll notice a lot of these UVs are mirrored. So you've got blue on the left side, you've got red on the right side. And the reason we sometimes keep them that way is so that we can reuse textures on the other side of the vehicle or the character or anything else. Otherwise you can flip them all so they conform to one direction, but either way I'm happy leaving them as is. I just thought I'd show you this updated layout so it looks a bit prettier now with their right side counterparts next to them, and we've also got those center pieces crammed in there too. So overall this is pretty good. We've got everything based on materials, everything's laid out nice and orderly, we've got our truck grouped now with all of its names. So this is the end of the chapter now. All that we have to do next is just go over the truck one more time just to make those adjustments on the other side, and we can also cover any imperfections that we'll need to add, bending any of these panels around or any dents or wear and tear, and then we can finish off with some nice renders. Thanks for watching, and I hope everything made sense. I hope you learned something from it, and I'll see you in the next chapter.